The rain had been falling since before dawn, the kind of steady, purposeless rain that does not announce itself with thunder or apologize with brief intervals but simply continues, as if it has made a commitment to the day that it intends to honor regardless of anyone's preferences. By 7 in the morning, the streets around the federal compound in the Northern District were rivers of reflected streetlight, and the guards at the main entrance had retreated as far back under their protective overhang as their posts would allow, which was not very far, and their uniforms showed it. The compound was not a place that announced itself. There was no sign at the main gate identifying the organization that occupied the 3 buildings behind the perimeter fence, no insignia on the vehicles that moved in and out on an irregular schedule that followed no pattern a casual observer could identify. The fence itself was the kind that discouraged examination rather than inviting it. 12 feet of gray metal topped with wire that was decorative in the sense that it did not need to actively deter because the cameras and the ground sensors, and the things beneath the asphalt that the engineers described in language that most people did not need to understand did the actual work. The guard at the main booth was named Pervez. He was 26 years old, had been at this post for 14 months, and had developed the particular quality that extended gate duty produces in certain personalities, a combination of boredom, low-level authority, and the compensatory significance that people attach to gatekeeping when it is the primary form of power available to them. He was not a bad person. He was a person whose situation had shaped him in specific ways, as situations do, and one of those ways was a sensitivity to the performance of credentialing that expressed itself as skepticism toward anything that did not fit the established pattern of arrivals at his gate. Most arrivals fit the pattern exactly. Dark vehicles, official plates, men in suits or uniforms who presented credentials with the ease of long practice, and the mild impatience of people who considered verification a formality rather than a genuine function. Pervez processed them with smooth efficiency, the barrier rising and falling on a rhythm so established that it had become essentially automatic. At 7:14, a vehicle pulled up to the booth that interrupted the rhythm. It was not an official vehicle. It was a 5-year-old sedan in a shade of blue that had faded unevenly, the kind of car that suggests its owner values function over impression, with a small crack in the lower right corner of the windshield that had been there long enough to develop a faint brown edge. The woman who stepped out of it was wearing dark trousers and a plain gray jacket over a black shirt, carrying a single bag over one shoulder that was neither large nor small, the kind of bag that could contain a laptop or files or lunch or all 3. She was 41 years old, medium height, with close-cropped hair and the kind of face that could belong to an accountant or a professor or a mid-level manager in any of 100 unremarkable industries. She walked to the booth with an unhurried step and presented her identification card to Pervez through the window. Pervez looked at the card. Then he looked at the woman. Then he looked at the card again, specifically at the section that identified her clearance level and organizational designation, and something happened in his expression that was not quite disbelief but was in the neighborhood of it. He processed the card through the initial reader, waited for the first-level confirmation, and then, and this was the part that would stay with the 3 other guards within earshot, he laughed. It was not a cruel laugh exactly. It was the laugh of a person who has encountered something that his established frameworks have no category for, an involuntary expression of cognitive dissonance that arrived before his professional training could suppress it. It lasted perhaps 1 second, this laugh, and in that second it contained everything that the woman standing in the rain had been encountering in various forms for 20 years. He caught himself and began a sentence about standard verification procedures and the requirement for secondary confirmation for certain clearance levels, which was a real procedure, but which everyone at the post knew was applied selectively, and which had not been applied to a single one of the suits in dark vehicles that morning. The woman said nothing. She stood in the rain with her bag on her shoulder, and her identification extended toward the booth window and her expression carrying nothing except patience. The deep, unagitated patience of someone who has been waiting in various forms for a very long time and has made a functional peace with the waiting that does not require it to be over. Pervez ran the card through the secondary reader. The system took 4 seconds to respond, which was longer than the standard response time of under 2 seconds, because the level of clearance encoded in the card required verification against a database that was not the primary system, and that had security protocols layered on security protocols in the manner of things that are protected not merely because they are valuable, but because they are categorically different from everything around them. When the response came, it came not as a simple confirmation but as a full identity resolution, which meant that the secondary screen in Pervez's booth lit up with information. He read it. He read it again. The 3 other guards who were close enough to see the secondary screen also read it, in the particular sequential way that groups of people read something unexpected, each one waiting for the next to confirm that they were seeing what they appeared to be seeing. The silence that followed lasted longer than any silence that Gate Station had produced in 14 months. The rain continued falling. The woman stood with her bag on her shoulder. The barrier remained where it was. What the screen showed was a name, a photograph that matched the face outside the booth, a clearance designation that occupied the highest category in the system's hierarchy, and below that an operational record summary that the system was required by internal protocol to display when credentials of this level were verified. The summary was not comprehensive. The actual record existed in a different system entirely, one that this terminal did not have the authorization to access and could only gesture toward, but the summary was sufficient. Pervez stood up from his chair. This was not standard gate protocol. He stood up from his chair and pressed the button that raised the barrier, and then he did something that was also not standard gate protocol, but that expressed something the situation seemed to require. He stepped out of the booth into the rain and held the booth door open, as if the woman approaching on foot required the assistance usually reserved for vehicles. The woman walked through the gate with the same unhurried step she had maintained throughout, and as she passed the booth, she retrieved her identification card from where Pervez was still holding it. Their eyes met briefly, and what she saw in his expression was not the response she had seen on too many faces in too many similar moments across 20 years, not the particular combination of surprise and recalibration that she had come to expect, not the performance of correction from someone who had been caught in a bias and was now managing their embarrassment. What she saw was something closer to recognition, the specific recognition of a person who has just understood that they have been operating with an entirely insufficient map of the territory. She went into the building. Her name was Rania Mir. She had been recruited into the intelligence service 20 years ago from a graduate program in applied mathematics, where her dissertation on pattern recognition in complex systems had been read by people whose professional interest in pattern recognition operated in contexts her dissertation committee had not been cleared to know about. The recruitment had been quiet, and the transition from academic to operational had been faster than was typical, because the evaluation process had concluded early with a degree of consensus that the file noted as unusual. In the 20 years since, she had operated in 8 countries under 7 different cover identities. She had run networks of sources in environments where the cost of discovery was not professional consequence but death, and she had run them with a record that the people who maintained such records described in terms that were not typically used for records of this kind. She had recruited and managed assets in organizations that specifically and systematically eliminated security vulnerabilities, which meant that her assets had survived in environments designed to find and destroy them. She had conducted operations in denied areas where the support infrastructure that most intelligence work depended on was entirely absent, where every decision was made without consultation, and every consequence was carried alone. She had made decisions that would not appear in any official account of the operations they shaped, decisions made in the particular darkness of situations where all available options were bad, and the work required choosing the least bad one with incomplete information and no time. She had carried those decisions in the way that people carry things that cannot be set down, which is constantly and without drama, and with the understanding that carrying them is part of the work. The kill count that the secondary screen had displayed was not a number she thought about in terms of the number itself. It was the residue of 20 years of work in environments where the alternative to the actions it represented had been outcomes she had been sent specifically to prevent, outcomes that would have produced numbers considerably larger on the other side of the ledger. She thought about it the way surgeons think about the operations that did not succeed, not with detachment, but with the knowledge that the accounting was more complex than any single number could represent. She had been summoned to the compound that morning for a meeting that she had not requested and had not anticipated, which was itself a category of event that occupied a specific place in her experience. Unexpected summons in her line of work were either opportunities or problems, and the distinction between them was not always clear at the moment of arrival. The building she entered was the middle of the three on the compound, unremarkable inside in the way that operational facilities are unremarkable inside, functional furniture and fluorescent lighting, and the particular atmosphere of a place where serious work is conducted without any investment in the environment that surrounds the work. A woman at the reception desk processed her credentials without the booth sequence repeating itself, with the smooth professional efficiency of someone whose job was to verify rather than to evaluate. She was directed to the third floor. The third floor had a different quality than the floors below it, not in its physical characteristics, which were the same functional furniture and fluorescent lighting, but in the particular density of the silence that occupied it. The kind of silence that exists in spaces where decisions are made that most people do not know are being made. She was shown to a conference room by a young officer whose composure was very good and whose eyes gave away the fact that he had been briefed on who he was escorting, given away not dramatically, but in the micro-adjustment of attention that people produce when they are trying not to produce it. She sat at the conference table and placed her bag beside her chair and waited. 3 people came in 7 minutes later. She knew 2 of them. Director Imran Shah, who ran the service's operational division and who had been her indirect superior for the last 6 years, moving up through the hierarchy as she had moved through her operational assignments, their careers running parallel to each other in the way that careers in institutions sometimes do when they are both shaped by the same sequence of significant events. And beside him, a woman named Brigadier Zoya Ansari from the Military Intelligence Directorate, who had been the service liaison on 2 of Rainia's most operationally complex assignments, and who had a reputation within both institutions as the person you brought in when the situation was beyond the reach of standard approaches. The third person was a man she did not recognize, which in itself was information, because her work had required her to know the operational leadership of both the service and its primary partner institutions to a depth that went well beyond organizational charts. He was perhaps 55, with the bearing of someone who had spent decades in environments where bearing was a professional requirement, and he was watching her with the careful attention of someone conducting an evaluation he had not yet concluded. Shah said her name and thanked her for coming in on short notice. He said it in the way of someone who understands that the phrase is a courtesy rather than an accurate description of the options that had been available to her, and she received it in that spirit. She said that she was happy to be here, which was also a courtesy, and waited. Shah said that they had a situation. He said this with the particular economy of language that intelligence professionals use when they are providing context rather than briefing, when the detail will come, but the framing must be established first. He said that an operation had developed over the previous 72 hours into a configuration that the standard response protocols were not designed to address. He said that assets were at risk, that a window was open that would not remain open, and that the analysis of the situation had converged on a conclusion that he wanted to present to her directly. She said to go ahead. He described the situation in the precise, information-dense language of operational briefing, the kind of description that compresses maximum relevant information into minimum words, because the people in the room do not need context or explanation, only facts and their operational implications. As he spoke, she processed the information the way she had been processing operational information for 20 years, not with the conscious analytical effort that the process resembled from outside, but with the faster and less visible integration that came from having done this for so long that the analysis was less a deliberate activity than a continuous background process. The situation was, in its essential shape, a kind that she had encountered before in different configurations. An asset network that had been stable for 4 years had been penetrated. Not catastrophically, not completely, but enough that 3 of the network's 7 members were now at risk of identification within a timeframe that the service's assessment put at between 48 and 96 hours. The penetration had come not through the network's internal security, but through an external element, a data breach in a partner organization that had exposed a connection that should not have been exposable. The kind of breach that happened at the intersection of 2 systems that had each been individually secure, but whose security had not accounted for the contact point between them. The 3 at-risk assets needed to be extracted. This was straightforward in principle and complex in execution, because the environment in which the network operated was one that Rania knew better than almost anyone in the service, having run assets there for 3 of her 20 years. And one of the 3 at-risk individuals was someone she had personally recruited and run for 2 of those 3 years. Someone whose position had been established through a sequence of decisions and investments that no one currently in the service had been part of except her. Shah said that the extraction plan that the current operational team had developed was sound within its constraints, but that the team lead had identified a gap in the plan's ability to manage a specific contingency, a contingency that depended on knowledge of the environment and of the specific assets' behavioral patterns that the current team did not possess. He said that her name had emerged from the analysis as the person whose knowledge of the environment and of the asset in question made her the most qualified person to close the gap. She said that she had been out of the environment for 3 years, and that 3 years was a significant interval in operational terms. Brigadier Ansari, who had not spoken until this moment, said that they were aware of the interval and that the team's assessment had accounted for it, and that the conclusion had been the same after accounting for it. The man she did not recognize said something for the first time. He said that she had been brought here partly for the briefing she was receiving, and partly because there were people in the service who needed to understand more accurately what her record actually represented, and that the 2 purposes were related in ways that the next several hours would make clearer. She looked at him and said that she did not know who he was. He said that this was intentional and that it would not remain the case. Shah said that the unknown man was here as an observer from an oversight body, whose existence was not publicly acknowledged, and whose function was the evaluation of the service's senior operational personnel, for purposes that the unknown man would explain to her after the briefing. She processed this and said that she understood and that they should continue with the situation. The briefing continued for another 40 minutes. She asked questions at intervals, precise questions that identified the specific information gaps in the briefing, and that the 3 people across from her answered with the recognition of people encountering a quality of questioning that recalibrated their understanding of the conversation they were in. The questions demonstrated a familiarity with the environment, with the specific dynamics of the asset network, and with the operational variables in play that was, as Brigadier Ansari would later describe it in her own notes, like watching someone read a text in a language everyone else in the room had been struggling to translate. By the end of the briefing, the shape of her involvement was clear and had been accepted by all parties with a minimum of the negotiation that such agreements typically required. She would provide the extraction plan's missing element not by deploying into the environment, which the timeline did not permit, and which would have required a preparation period she did not have, but by working directly with the extraction team over the next 18 hours to transfer the environmental and asset-specific knowledge that the gap required. It was not glamorous work. It was the kind of work that the operational record she carried had been built from, the essential unglamorous work of preparing other people to do things that the situation required, of taking 20 years of accumulated understanding and making it transferable in a compressed time frame to people who would need to act on it in conditions that would not be ideal. She said that she was ready to start immediately. Shah looked at her for a moment with an expression that carried something she was experienced enough to read accurately. He said that before they moved to the work, the unknown man had something to say. The unknown man said his name, which was a name she did not recognize, and confirmed his role with the oversight body. He said that the oversight body's mandate included the periodic review of the service's most sensitive operational records for the purpose of ensuring that the individuals who carried those records were appropriately recognized within the institution, and that the institution's treatment of those individuals was consistent with their demonstrated contribution. He said that her record had been reviewed in the previous month, and that the review had produced a set of findings and recommendations that he was authorized to share with her. She said nothing and waited. He said that her operational record over 20 years represented, in the assessment of the oversight body, and in the independent assessment of 3 former service directors who had been consulted as part of the review, a contribution to the national security of the kind that the institution had historically recognized in certain ways that he would describe. He said that the record showed a pattern of operational success in conditions of exceptional difficulty, a pattern that had produced outcomes of strategic significance on multiple occasions, and a pattern that had been insufficiently recognized within the institution's formal acknowledgement structures. He said that the oversight body was recommending her elevation to a senior directorial role that had been vacant for 8 months, and for which she had not been considered, not for reasons related to her qualifications, but for reasons related to the institutional assumptions that the oversight body's review had identified as inconsistent with her record. He said the word assumptions the way people say words when they want to be precise about what they are nomming, without being inflammatory about the nomming of it. She said that she understood what he was describing. He said that he thought she probably understood it better than anyone in the room, given that she had been navigating it for 20 years. She said that navigation was one word for it. He said that another word might be endurance, and that endurance of that kind over that duration in service of work of that significance was itself a form of contribution that the institution owed an explicit acknowledgement. The room was quiet for a moment. Through the window, the rain continued its commitment to the day, slightly lighter now than it had been at 7 in the morning, beginning perhaps to consider revising its position. She said that she appreciated the oversight body's work and the finding, and that she wanted to be clear about something before she responded to the recommendation. She said that her motivation for the work she had done over 20 years had not been recognition, which was probably evident from the record, since a person primarily motivated by recognition would have shaped their career differently. She said that she had done the work because the work mattered, and because she was capable of doing it, and because capability in service of work that mattered was, in her view, a sufficient reason to do it. She said that this did not mean recognition was unimportant. She said that the absence of appropriate recognition had consequences not only for the individuals who did not receive it, but for the institutions that failed to provide it. Because institutions that systematically misrecognized contribution in the ways that the oversight body had identified created environments that discouraged the development of exactly the kind of capability that operational success depended on. She said that the young officers who were currently developing in the service were watching what the institution did with people like her, and that what they saw shaped what they believed was possible for people like them. She said that for those reasons, she would accept the recommendation. The unknown man said that this was the response the oversight body had anticipated, and that the formal process would begin the following week. Shah said something then that he said in the manner of a person saying something that costs something. He said that he had been her indirect superior for 6 years, and her operational file manager for 3 of those years, and that there were specific moments in the file where he had been in a position to advocate more strongly for her recognition than he had, and that reviewing the file with the oversight body's assessment in front of him had been an uncomfortable exercise. She looked at him and said that she knew he had advocated when it had been within his capacity to do so, and that the constraints on that capacity had been institutional rather than personal, and that she had understood this at the time. He said that the distinction did not entirely satisfy him. She said that it did not entirely satisfy her either, but that they had work to do, and that doing the work well was the best response available to both of them. He said yes, and they moved to the work. The extraction team met with her in a secure briefing room on the 2nd floor for 6 hours that afternoon and evening. There were 4 of them, experienced operators who had been working the environment for between 1 and 3 years, and who had the particular quality of people who know they are competent, and are honest about the specific gap in their competence that they are trying to close. They received the knowledge she gave them without the performance of inadequacy that some people produce when acknowledging they need help, which she appreciated, and they asked the right questions, which she appreciated more. By 10 in the evening, the extraction plan had the element it had been missing. The team lead, a woman named Farah who had 6 years of operational experience and the kind of analytical precision that reminded Rania of herself at a comparable stage, said that she was confident in the plan and that the contingency the gap had exposed was now manageable. Rania said that the asset's behavioral pattern under stress had one characteristic that was not in any file and that Farah needed to know about it. A specific tell that the asset produced when their trust in a situation was failing, that a competent operator who did not know to watch for it would miss, and that Farah now needed to watch for it. Farah wrote it down and said that this was exactly the kind of information that the gap had been about. Rania said yes. She said that a lot of the most important information was exactly that kind. The kind that lived in direct experience and could not be adequately transferred through files and briefings, and that this was one of the reasons that the institutional pattern the oversight body had identified had operational as well as human costs, because experience like hers, when it was not in the room where decisions were made, left gaps in exactly the places where gaps were most dangerous. Farah said that she intended to remember this conversation for a long time. Rania said that she hoped the extraction would go well, and that she would be available if questions arose during execution. She left the compound at 10:45, walking back through the main gate into a night where the rain had finally honored its implied earlier intention and reduced itself to a fine mist that softened the streetlights into halos. The barrier rose as she approached, and she walked through without stopping, her bag on her shoulder, her step the same unhurried measure it had been at 7:14 that morning. The guard booth was staffed by different personnel at this hour. She did not look for Pervez. The morning's exchange at the gate was not something she carried with her as a grievance or a wound or even a lesson, because it had not been a new lesson. It had been a repetition of a familiar one, and familiar lessons did not require the same processing that new ones did. She got into her faded blue sedan and sat for a moment in the dark, not thinking about anything in particular, which was something she had learned to create intervals of genuine emptiness between one thing and the next, because 20 years had taught her that the space between things was where understanding often arrived, unhurried, when she had stopped demanding it. Then she started the car and drove through the wet streets toward the city's center, where her apartment occupied the top floor of an undistinguished building that she had chosen for its sight lines and its multiple exit routes and its proximity to 3 different transit options, because some habits were so deeply established that they had become indistinguishable from preferences. The extraction executed successfully 31 hours later. All 3 assets were removed from the environment without incident. The contingency that the plan had been built to manage did not materialize, but Farah's team was ready for it, which was the point of readiness, and which was something that Rainia understood in the particular way of someone who had spent 20 years being ready for contingencies that did not materialize, and knowing that the non-materialization was not luck but preparation. She received a brief message from Farah the following morning. It contained 2 words and a set of coordinates that she recognized as the extraction point. The 2 words were simply, all out. She read the message in her apartment over coffee, looking out the window at a city that had dried out overnight from the previous day's rain, and was now doing what cities do in the morning, producing its ordinary noise and movement and purposeful chaos with complete indifference to the events that had occurred within it, and around it that it would never know about. She put down her phone and finished her coffee. She thought about the gate, and the laugh, and the 4 seconds the system had taken to return its response, and the silence in the booth afterward. She thought about 20 years of work that had produced a record that could silence a room, and that had also, consistently and without exception, failed to produce the institutional recognition that the record warranted until an oversight body had been required to formally identify the gap. She thought about Farah, who was 6 years into a career that was beginning to show the shape it would eventually have, and about what it would mean for Farah's development if the institution she worked within had people in its senior roles whose records looked like Rainia's record, who could look at a situation and read it the way a person reads a text in their native language, who had the kind of knowledge that only 20 years of consequential work in difficult environments could produce. She thought about the directorial role, and about the oversight body's recommendation, and about the work ahead, which was the kind of work that she had not done before, the work of operating within an institution at a level where institutional culture was not something to be navigated but something to be shaped. She had spent 20 years being exceptionally good at a specific kind of work. The work ahead would require her to be good at a different kind, and she was realistic about the learning curve that represented. She had never been afraid of learning curves. She had been afraid, occasionally, of situations where the cost of the learning was paid by people other than herself. But that was a different kind of fear, a responsible one, and she intended to carry it carefully into the new work the same way she had carried everything else. She washed her coffee cup, put on her jacket, picked up her bag, and left the apartment. She had a meeting at 9. She was already, in the way she was always already, prepared.